Our next speaker is Dr. Suzanne Hollman. She is the Associate Director and Dean of the Institute for Psychological Sciences.
Good morning. When a psychologist comes to speak, most people expect bad news. So I have mixed news this morning. So I looked at the emotional and psychological side effects of oral contraception. So let me start with the bad news. Approximately 1 in 4 women will experience mood dysregulation in their lifetime. Women have approximately a 14% increased risk compared to men. Why is this relevant? Well, one of the side effects we just saw in our previous presentation was that there are these side effects that have emotional consequences for women who do take hormonal contraceptives. What do we know about the science of this? Well, every time I present a paper, I feel I have to say it's mixed. The research right now longitudinally is mixed. It's mixed for a good reason, though. It's mixed partly because it's not been investigated enough before. And the good news is that people are starting to look at this in a very real way and realizing that we do not have enough longitudinal research on things like brain structure or emotional side effects. This brings us into the realm of the philosophy of science. I promise I won't talk about the philosophy of science for very long, but it is worth noting that there is body politics involved here. Hilary Putnam argues that scientific investigation is always tied to a very particular epistemology, and I think we all have a sense of what that epistemology is. We've got these two camps. We've got people who will not ever talk about NFP, and we've got people who will only prescribe, as we just heard, the pressure to prescribe in a hospital. Having had children myself, I hadn't even been dismissed from the hospital, the 24 hours you get, without having been given 3 or 4 different options for what I could be using while I was still recovering. Putnam's work is of particular relevance to the argument long made by activists, both religious and, interestingly enough, also secular feminists, who point out the disconnect between these women who say, look, I'm experiencing side effects from taking hormonal contraceptives, and the dismissive attitude with which they are frequently confronted within the medical, pharmaceutical, political, and scientific community, dismissing their experiences as anecdotal, exceptional, and unsubstantiated. She asserts that while there is some utility to making a distinction between what science would classify as truth and fact at the one extreme and value judgments and experience on the other, this distinction becomes very dangerous when viewed as simply a dichotomy between what is purely objective and what is purely subjective. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, similarly points out that there is no value-free science. The act of the scientist observing a phenomenon alters it in and of itself. Translated into the patient-doctor, and I would argue psychologist-patient or psychologist-client relationship, the way in which we listen and prescribe will inevitably affect the relationship with the patient and the ultimate outcome. The prevailing politicized narrative that there is no need for women to be concerned in the slightest about any of the psychological side effects of oral contraceptives is grossly oversimplified when we looked at the literature. A thorough reading shows that not all women's bodies are uniform. Who knew? And that there is a possibility that different bodies respond differently to different drugs. Again, who knew? The definition of what constitutes mood within the context of hormonal birth control appears to fall into the subcategories of anxiety, irritability, depression, and mood swings. The biological theories as to how hormonal contraceptives affect mood include estrogen-induced pyridoxine deficiency, or estrogen and progesterone interaction with the serotoninergic system in the brain, or the norandrogenic systems. I wish I had time to go into all of this. It's in the paper. But again, we know that LARCs especially is not very well researched nor very well understood, and we know that they are prescribed with great frequency. The research in this area longitudinally is inconclusive at this point, which is why I think there's a really big fight right now. Some authors even go as far as saying that there are no adverse mental health effects. And in fact, that the use of oral hormonal contraceptives is often associated with better mood. Again, if you look at studies from Finland, Toffel and colleagues, they reached this conclusion. They looked at data from 91, 2002, and 2007. But right at the end of these articles, you have to read these articles all the way through. You will often find disclaimers such as, these authors concluded that the association between the length of time that the woman has taken oral contraception, hormonal contraceptives, and any associated long-term mental health effects that may be at play are unclear. So I suppose we should only care about very short-term effects. I can tell you that as a psychologist, that's not a good idea. Because typically when someone's depressed, we know that the odds of depression reoccurring is a lifelong risk once someone has had a postpartum episode or just any episode of clinical depression. In 2015, a very pro-oral contraceptive article by Hall and colleagues similarly identified gaps in the research. This was a very heavy-hitting advocacy tone, and when I read the article, I felt like they were literally standing on a soapbox reading their thing. The tone was incredible. But again, they concluded that additional research that uses rigorous, prospective, longitudinal, randomized, controlled trial designs are direly needed to provide a fuller picture of what exactly it is that we're dealing with. I can go on, but I think it becomes very clear that different women respond differently to different doses at different times. Even at different times in the cycle, we find different effects. The reason a lot of these researchers are interested in researching more about this is unfortunately part of the more depressing part of my presentation. They are worried that women are going to discontinue. So a lot of this is framed within discontinuation rates, which concerns them. In fact, approximately 21% of women cite discontinuation side effects as the reason for them not wanting to fill their prescriptions anymore. And the medical establishment, the mainstream medical establishment, is concerned about this. There does seem to be a high prevalence of women who report depression and anxiety symptoms while on hormonal contraceptives. And what the scientific community has decided to do is to start identifying a subgroup of women who may be at risk. This is a very interesting strategy. So what we have now is the narrative that it's okay for most people, but there may be a very small subset of women who respond negatively to this. Panoma and Segerblad's researchers, they are among the prominent researchers who have found that this is in fact a very real phenomenon for some women, as if this is the most incredible novel news that we've ever heard. And again, they are calling for an exploration of what consequences these compounds may have, not only for women's bodies, but also literally the way that their brains are formed. There are many complexities involved, and again, it is not clear. What is especially alarming is in the Journal of Adolescent Health. The authors interviewed 354 adolescent girls specifically about mood-related side effects, and what they found was a 21% depressed mood in the sample, 19% reported undue stress, and 25% of the sample they interviewed reported increased moodiness from prior to taking the medication. 24 of the 249 reported eating disordered symptoms. Once again, these authors are much too careful. I'm not sure who was funding this research, but they didn't go as far as saying that hormonal contraception causes these things. But the link was so clear that once again, they simply had no choice other than to conclude that more needs to be done in this area. The other really interesting area is here, what about women who have pre-existing conditions with depression and anxiety and mood disorders. And it has become quite apparent now that women who have a prior history of mood dysregulation, who then start taking any form of synthetic hormone, is at increased risk for future depression. So at least it seems like there's one area in which the science is becoming a bit more settled. Adolescence is a very vulnerable time, emotionally, socially, psychologically, but it is also a very vulnerable time in terms of brain plasticity. And plasticity and endocrine effects within the developing brain are central. And the idea that we are giving young girls whose brains are not developed yet a substance that is, for all intents and purposes, not known. We have no idea what this is going to do to the brain long term. What we are starting to see is changes in morphology in the brain. We also know that anxiety, depression, eating disorders often start during adolescence. So if you put all of this together, it's a slightly nightmarish scenario. And my colleagues who work with adolescents, I don't work with adolescents anymore. I decided that that was not a good career choice for me. The point is, we're introducing a very unknown variable into a very vulnerable population with unknown long-term side effects. What is becoming clear is that these hormones have different effects on different brains and different bodies to different degrees at different ages. But there's very limited information on what these effects on the developing brains are. The etiology as to why some women with no prior mood disorders appear to be predisposed to affective disorders has not been clarified. But what we do know is that there is a risk. I would like to move on now to moving away a bit from the research, and as I said, there's a lot of it in my paper. I think it's like 110 journal articles, which, don't worry, I'm not going to go into that during this presentation. From an object relations perspective, though, when you start talking about hormonal contraception, you don't only talk about it from a medical perspective. Medication has meaning beyond that of being an inanimate object. There is a relationship between the person on the one hand and the medication given and taken on the other. It is fraught with conflict and meaning. Fain and colleagues argue that an object relations theory perspective on medication serves as, quote, a gateway to one's inner world and the way that he or she perceives authority figures, peers, and oneself. The psychoanalyst Adele Tutter argues that medication is imbued with symbolic meaning that shifts over time and reveals aspects of the relationship that one has with oneself and with others. The idea here is that the medication you start taking at 15 is not the same type of medication you take at 20, even though it's exactly the same prescription. Your relationship with that medication changes as you change, as your life circumstances change, as the way that you view your body and your relationship starts changing. In an acknowledgement of the importance for physicians to look beyond the pharmaceutical properties of hormonal contraceptives, the French psychiatrist Bourgeois outlines 4 levels that prescribing physicians should attend to. First, side effects and concerns about side effects should never be dismissed. Second, the consequences of not being able to conceive while on the pill should be talked about. Third, the motivations on the part of the patient for choosing hormonal contraception in the context of a prior psychiatric history of mood dysregulation should be attended to. And finally, the subconscious effects on society's view of sexuality and procreation should be examined. And I think this is extremely important. Where is all this pressure coming from, and how is it internalized? These approaches go well behind just seeing the person as a biological specimen. It incorporates the psychological, human motivation that exists sometimes even outside of human consciousness. What messages have young women been receiving from their mothers who may have grown up in a time when the pill was introduced? Or, what messages are they receiving in whatever publications they may read? Where can we locate fear, mistrust, and societal messages, and how does this affect our views of self and other? Fain and colleagues lament the fact that therapists and physicians often treat medication and the patient as 2 completely separate entities, as if there is no relationship there. I would argue that this should be the case even more so for contraception than for any other type of medication. Think about the last time you went to the doctor and they gave you a medication that you were worried about taking. But then add the psychology of it into something like contraception. It's a whole new level of complexity, and we're giving this to 14, 15-year-old kids who aren't even thinking about it yet, but they will later. The decision to use oral contraceptive have implications for existential and spiritual views of the self, the relationship with God, views on the family, morality, health, and relationships. In my clinical practice, I've seen firsthand the unexpected non-physiological side effects that can occur in response to taking a drug that has a definite emotional load, for which I didn't even need to read the journal articles to know about. I was referred a young Catholic woman with very severe endometriosis, and she was prescribed oral contraceptives to deal with it. She'd hoped to join a religious order, but no longer thought she could apply because after years of excruciating pain and surgery, she decided to try hormonal contraceptives. The ensuing guilt about taking the pill was in such opposition to her strong religious beliefs that she developed a hatred toward her own body, which she now viewed as a traitor to her faith. This is just one example. In another instance, a secular young woman who had chosen to have an IUD implanted on the recommendation of her OBGYN spoke at length in my work with her about her conflicting feelings around having something implanted into her body. While she was initially happy with the device, she experienced excruciating side effects that led to significant and prolonged bleeding. I actually had to end the session early one day because she was bleeding so much I sent her to the emergency room. She expressed anger not only at her physician but also towards her partner for what she perceived as being left alone, not only with the physical side effects of this implant, but also the perceived burden of being held solely responsible for her body's reproductive capacity. This illustrates how easily bioethics slips into the therapy room, and also how individuals turn against their bodies with serious psychological consequences as a result. There's a power dynamic involved here. The patient is being prescribed to by the physician, and this sets up a relationship that is by no means egalitarian. The ideal patient is compliant and tolerant of side effects. The feminist narrative of Emily Martin further shows that the language used to describe women's bodies is often framed in the negative, and she argues that women relate to their bodies in a way that is indicative of subjugation. Women have to control their bodies, and when they do, their mind that is prone to hormonal influences. The meta-message is that if women are not able to control their bodies and their fertility, they will return to their irrational, emotional, unmedicated state. So, oral contraceptives have been touted to help alleviate the natural states of premenstrual syndrome. In the campaign that Yaz launched to women, the balloons in the original advertisement, for which Bayer was later fined $20 million for false advertising, features the following words: irritability, moodiness, feeling anxious, and fatigue, among others. The messaging was that if you take Yaz, all of that will go away. It wasn't even about reproduction at that point. The aim here was the eradication of the fluctuating emotional states of crazy women. Women have to display restricted and predetermined emotional states wherein entire categories of normal human emotion, the normal ups and downs, are eliminated or rendered obsolete. Susan Faludi, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Wall Street Journal reporter, argues that the ideal woman is feminine, which means that she is forever static and childlike, silenced, infantilized, and frozen. The act of putting into a woman's body a substance that prevents a natural process, not only that of pregnancy, but also the alteration of the menses, the alteration of mood, the hope from the industrial complex for uninterrupted productivity, the increased predictability and availability of having sex is fraught with psychological and emotional meaning. Because we have to remember that not all women take hormonal contraceptives simply to avoid pregnancy. They also take it to even out mood states, to have better skin. You speak to any young woman and you will hear these things. The last thing I want to say is that women, young women especially, are often unprepared for what to expect from their bodies. I will give you just one very short case vignette to end with. A young woman had a history of mild depression. She came into my office sobbing one morning. I'd been working with her for about 5 years. I didn't know where this was from. She wasn't typically depressed. She was terrified of this persistent bleeding as a result of another IUD implant, and she was having the IUD removed later that week. When she returned the following week, she stated that she felt like, quote unquote, a double failure, because the physician dismissed her anxiety about the bleeding as just one of those things that happens sometimes. The message from the panopticon to this woman was that she was an exception, an aberration in the medical world where most bodies actually respond quite well to these implants. The pathologization of women's bodies and minds who do not respond in these expected ways, that is, with minimal, transient, or no side effects, has been largely dismissed by many within the medical profession. These minds and bodies disappear into the unreadable font at the bottom of glossy advertisements in women's magazines, dismissed as outliers. The feminist narrative is extremely useful here. Every body matters, every experience matters. Thank you.